Are these Swift experiments a game changer for Link? Let's talk about it. So hey everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about these experiments that Swift was able to successfully complete in collaboration with Chainlink and their CCIP protocol to transfer value across different blockchains. So essentially what this was, if we look at their press release about it, they collaborated with a whole bunch of different financial institutions. And they were doing experiments where they were looking at transferring value between different wallets on the same blockchain, different wallets on different blockchains, then also different wallets on public and private blockchains, transferring different simulated tokenized assets. And it was successful. That was the main takeaway from here. And this is really the value add of CCIP, is being this generalized interoperability framework where not only can you transact across different public blockchains, but even private and public, which would be something that would probably be desirable for financial institutions who might have their own in-house blockchains, but then might want to interact with either other private blockchains that other banks might have or other public blockchains. And so in this experiments here, they're using one of Ethereum's test nets for these experiments. And the reason why Swift is a big deal is that Swift facilitates a large amount of transactions, a large amount of transactions in dollar terms, in addition just to the number of messages that it transmits on a given day. And so the idea would be that if some small fraction of this were to end up eventually using CCIP, so you can either imagine interacting with public blockchains of these financial institutions or interacting between financial institutions on private blockchains, if they'd have a desire to do that, that this could be a massive demand driver for Link. And the way that CCIP works is that you have to pay fees when you use it. And those fees are more than just what you'd be paying in gas fee, for example, on Ethereum. Let's say that you're using CCIP to interact with Ethereum. It's more than just the gas fee you'd pay on Ethereum. You'd also pay this gas overhead as part of it, which would be a flat rate, and also this premium adjustment, which is a percentage-based aspect. So however much the gas is, you're paying some percentage above that just in a premium to use the network. And the idea is that even though you will be able to use a number of different assets to settle those fees, you're incentivized to do it in Link. There's going to be this 10% surcharge if you're using some other asset to pay for these fees instead of Link. And so most likely a lot of the transactions that are using CCIP would be using Link because it just makes sense to do so economically. And especially if you can imagine large players doing this, making a lot of these transactions, they want to be doing the cheapest thing because that would add up quite quickly if you're paying 10% extra on every single fee that you're paying. So the idea here then would be that in this kind of 2,000-foot view, macro long-term view, that if this were to pan out, where Swift were to start integrating with CCIP to facilitate these interoperability between different private and public blockchains, that you might see Link scoop up some fraction of these transactions or of these messages and of this value that's being transmitted. And that could then be a huge demand driver for Link based on the fact that probably a lot of people want to use Link to settle the fees for using the protocol. And so if you look at Link's market cap sitting right now at 3.2 billion, you might say that that seems way too low for a system that not only is providing Oracle services to the bulk of Web3, but also then would be helping in this interoperability aspect across all these different institutions, not only just in people using it themselves across different blockchains, but also maybe these institutions using it through something like Swift. That seems like this would be massively undervalued. But then what I want to talk about next is, if that's the case, if this seems so bullish, why haven't we seen it show up in Link's price? Link's price has not really done a whole lot based on this news. In fact, over the last few days, as I record this, it's just been continuing its bleed, its downtrend. What is going on? Well, I think the first thing that's important to note is that right now, where we are in the crypto market cycle, we're not at a place where there's a lot of speculative appetite. People aren't just jumping in and putting in a lot of inflows based on narratives. In fact, it seems more likely that we're just seeing the same money that's still in the system just churning around, but no major new influx of money flowing into the crypto space. And so you wouldn't really necessarily expect massive appreciation in price based on a news release like this. If we're in a bull market, that would be a different story. a news story like this coming out in a raging bull market would have seen Link's price go absolutely crazy. We're just not in that environment. We're not in that environment right now. And again, these are just experiments. We're not actually seeing these value transaction happening. We're not actually seeing CCIP used on some massive scale yet. And so of course we're not seeing that demand actually show up here. So that wouldn't be something that could drive price up either. And again, just to kind of bring home this idea of us being in a place where speculative appetite isn't really there, look at what happened to Bitcoin recently. We had this big pump based on the news that Grayscale won their ETF conversion lawsuit against the SEC that caused Bitcoin's price to pump. But then we just gave it all up in the next couple of days. And so that's where I think it's probably not particularly realistic to think that this kind of news on its own could be what would break Link back up to the upside, because there's just not enough new demand coming into the space to do that. Now, another thing I think is interesting and is also important for why Link's price action has been the way it's been recently is some other things that are just internal to Link. So one thing that's you'll notice when I'm showing you here this market cap chart for Link is notice how here in July, the market cap for Link got back up to the range high throughout this whole time, and that the low here in June did not set a new low relative to what we saw in June of 22 or in May of 22. It was basically the exact same level that we wicked down to. But you look at price, that's telling a different story. We did set in a new low back in June of 23, and we did not get back up to the range high here in July of this year. So what the heck's going on? Why are we seeing this divergence between market cap and price? Well, it's really circulating supply. It's supply dynamics. You'll notice with Link that ever since October of 2020, there's been a pretty big increase in the circulating supply of Link, basically just Link being released out into the world. And we know from basic supply and demand dynamics that when you have an increase in supply, you need more demand to get price up to the same level. And so what's likely been happening is that demand for Link has remained relatively stable throughout this whole time. But because the supply for Link has been increasing, we're seeing this decoupling where price is actually starting to move down. And so I have this chart here where you can actually visualize it. You can see that in October, when those increases in circulating supply started happening, then you'll see market cap start decoupling to the upside, which it should. Market cap is price times circulating supply. If you have circulating supply increasing, then it should be moving up faster than price, for example. And then we can really see it throughout here where market caps remain stable. Price has been ever so slowly moving into a downtrend, especially more recently. And so that's where I think we are, that in the short term, I suspect the thing more likely to drive Link's price is the supply dynamics, that as we see more and more Link hitting the market, and it will, we're only at 50% of the Link total supply currently out in the market, so more is going to be getting released. Until we see some influx in demand, I would expect Link's price to be affected by that increase in supply. And every single time we have new unlocks, there's probably going to be more and more selling pressure, which will cause Link's price to likely bleed out. And then for that to change, you need to see an influx in demand. And that could either happen because the market turns to be more bullish, more speculative demand, which would be what I would expect in the more short term or shorter term would be the thing that would break us to the upside. It would just be a change in market sentiment. But you also could imagine that once CCIP maybe gets adopted more broadly, once it really gets out there, exits early access, and gets used, it's probably not going to be used by the Swift network immediately, but it could be used by the broader crypto market, and that could add some natural demand into the space. So we want to think then about when, with this Swift news, when might we actually see some of this materialize and some demand from this actually come into Link? There's some other things that we need to consider. So the last point that I want to talk about here is that there was this bigger report that was released by Swift. One of the things they talked about straight away in their executive summary of the report was how one of the big challenges as they see it for the tokenization of assets being really realizing its full potential is this lack of regulatory clarity, or this kind of fragmentation. There's not a clear picture across jurisdictions, and especially in the United States where regulators have been quite hostile to crypto so far, that's been a big barrier. And what I suspect is the case is that these large financial institutions are probably not all that eager to dump massive amounts of money into setting up infrastructure around CCIP until they have a better sense that regulators aren't just going to slap them down, that the SEC isn't going to come out, label Link as a security, or that there wouldn't be legislation passed in the United States that would be very hostile to crypto. They probably want to wait and see what happens before dumping a lot of money into that space. And so that's one of the things I think is going to be important to keep in mind here, is that there are some steps, some hurdles that will probably need to get passed first before we'd really see that broad fundamental thesis actually be able to come to full fruition, and for Link to be able to actually capitalize on some fraction of this of these funds that are moving back and forth being facilitated by Swift. So certainly that could happen. And so I think ultimately the thesis then for Link of what this means going forward is that Link is certainly moving in the right direction. Chainlink, with these kind of things, these are what you like to see to be moving in that direction. But probably another reason why we haven't seen things move up in the price, just in addition to where we are in the market cycle, is that there's still so much uncertainty out there about the regulatory environment and how things could shape up and how Swift could maybe eventually be integrated with CCIP that people aren't willing to make massive bets yet. But for any individual person evaluating this, it would ultimately come down to your own subjective evaluation of how likely things are. How likely is it that we get favorable regulation in not just the United States, but also elsewhere that would allow for a full-on integration with Swift and CCIP? That's going to be one thing. How quick and how large would those inflows or would that use of CCIP be by the Swift network? That would be another thing to keep in mind. But then ultimately, if you think those things will fall into place, I think it's quite reasonable to think that this is a pretty big undervaluation for Chainlink at a $3.2 billion valuation if it eventually ends up being the protocol, or at least a main protocol, that's facilitating transaction or movement of trillions of dollars worth of funds. So that's something that's going to be interesting to watch. And then in just a broader case, then, if we're just thinking internal to crypto and we're comparing Chainlink to other altcoins, what this does also suggest is that there is a very real possibility or very real pathway for Link to become an altcoin that has a real world driver of revenue that's decoupled from the broader crypto hype cycles. That would be this thing where it's just facilitating transactions. That's just going to be a thing that happens in the world between financial institutions. That's not going to go away. And if even just a small fraction of that use CCIP, that could be a pretty decent demand driver that's bringing in revenue and demand for Link that could be kind of sustainable demand. That's not just purely based on speculation, which a lot of other altcoins, that's what they rely on, is speculation. So we'll have to watch and see what happens, but I think that this is certainly a great step in the right direction for Link, and that even though it might not materialize in the price in the short term, in the long term, it could be setting the stage for Link to do something quite impressive. So not financial advice. You should make your own opinions, come to your own conclusions about this. But those are some of the things that I'm thinking about right now. All right, if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like and follow us on Twitter. A lot of updates, better indicators, and more over there.